Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. This is the Alliance for Water Efficiency webinar on NetBlue, Supporting Water Neutral Community Growth. We're very pleased that you've joined us today. We have a 60-minute webinar for you where we'll talk about our Alliance for Water Efficiency NetBlue program. And just want to welcome everyone who's registered for the webinar and joining us today. We will plan to have a webinar of 60 minutes in length, which includes at least 10 minutes for questions. The audio for this webinar is coming through either your telephone or your computer microphone and speakers. You need to choose one or the other. If you're hearing my voice, you've obviously figured that all out. And we will be muting the webinar line so that all background noises from the participants will be minimized. We record our webinars to make them available to you in the future. So in order to make sure we have a clean recording, we mute all the participants during the course of the webinar. But that doesn't mean we don't want your participation. We very much want your participation. And we encourage you to type in questions all throughout the webinar itself. You can find the dialogue chat box to do that by looking in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. There's a bar with a orange square with a white arrow, orange rectangle with a white arrow. If you click that, it opens up the dialog box and you can type in your question, which we will take in the order that the questions were received at the end of the speakers' presentations. So we encourage you to go ahead and type questions in as we go along so that we will be able to answer those in an expeditious fashion when the webinar itself is finished. So today we have a number of speakers that are going to talk with you about our NetBlue project. In addition to myself, Mary Ann Dickinson, I'm with the Alliance for Water Efficiency. We have Adam Schempp with the Environmental Law Institute, Bill Christensen with Water Forever, also formerly of AWE, and David Mitchell of the firm M-Cubed. We're going to be talking to you today about the toolkit that we've assembled for the NetBlue project. So by way of introduction, the NetBlue project attempts to reconcile the issues of increasing demand, water demand from development, with a potential water scarcity situation in a community. As we know, many cities in North America are already challenged to meet what customer demands are for water. As drought cycles in and out of various cities across the country, it places demands not only on the existing customers, but on new development that might be anticipated. So as our population grows and as our economy grows, arid areas in particular are suffering from intense pressure and desires for trying to figure out how they can sustainably grow within the confines of their existing water supply and wastewater infrastructure. And of course the consumers are weighing in as well, because as drought and water shortages are occurring and residents are under restrictions, they are raising in public forums the issue of why water is being made available for new development when they, as existing customers, are being restricted. So it provides some discussion opportunities for equity issues and very intense community discussions about the role of development and the role of water supply in meeting that development. This is a map that kind of characterizes that conflict. It's a map from the WaterSense website, and it shows in percentages what the growth was between the year 2000 and the year 2015 in the various states around the country. And as you look at where the states are experiencing double-digit growth, in many of those states, particularly with high double-digit growth, those are states with very confined water supplies and arid water supply situations. Look at Nevada with 43% growth in that period, and they are clearly, a desert state with, limited water supplies. So we have a situation already where we're growing in areas where water supplies are limited. So we need to figure out a way to adapt to that clear phenomenon. So one particular story I can tell from my own personal experience, I sat on the Lake Arrowhead Community Services District Board for a period of time, and we had a very severe water shortage in 2006. This was before the recession, when development was pretty well booming. Lots of applications coming before the community for approval. But we were running out of the ability to supply those new developments because we were really running out of water, importing and spending huge amounts of money to import water to try and cover what our demand was in the system. And at the same time, our consumers were angry. They were filling our boardroom, angry at the fact that they were being charged for this extra water and being restricted when we were approving lots of new connections. So the board at that time considered a building moratorium, and I need to tell you from personal experience, it's not a happy occasion. It's not something you ever want to be doing in your community. It pits people against each other. It's a very difficult situation. And the developers, of course, were quite concerned because it would shut down their businesses for the most part if we went to a complete building moratorium. We ended up in the community doing a little bit of a moratorium. In the end, we passed an ordinance limiting new connections to only 5 new connections a month. And that's not new subdivisions, that's new housing connections, only 60 new housing connections a year. So that's a very strong growth limiter. It's a problem. The community has since recovered from that particular shortage situation through a lot of water conservation programs that have helped reduce demand. But the phenomenon of a building moratorium being instituted because of a shortage in water supply is a very real situation in many parts of the country. So what's the answer to that? The answer to that is water offsets. That could be a strategy for allowing development to occur if that new water use is offset. Development can occur in a community as long as the system-wide water consumption across the community can remain on a relatively level basis. And how that offset can be achieved can be a combination of strong on-site water efficiency improvements in the development that's proposed, as well as off-site water efficiency retrofits and other strategies that can occur that can offset the rest of the new potable water demand. And what we'll talk about today is how that might work. We've developed a program for analyzing how that might work. Because the intention of the program is to reduce or completely eliminate the impact of new development on water supply, to try to keep water supply demand relatively constant as population and as development is occurring, and help avoid those contentious building moratoriums in communities that are resource strained or water stressed. And the stress can be water supply, or can be even wastewater capacity or drinking water capacity, of treatment capacity, whatever that constraint is that is preventing additional water consumption. That's a constraint that an offset can address. But it's not really a new idea. I mean, offsets have been used in air quality programs for at least 2 or 3 decades. They are used in wetlands mitigations, and we've seen across the country that they've been used for water supply purposes. So the first thing we did at the Alliance for Water Efficiency, and Bill Christensen on this webinar today was the author of this report, AWE conducted some research to look at what communities had already adopted something similar in a planning and zoning ordinance. Where were offsets already being looked at? What kind of terminology did these communities use? What documentation was provided by them? And what were some of the policies, both existing and past policies that might have been, repealed? What were some of those policies, and what could we learn from them? One particular example that we looked at was Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was an example of a community that did such an offset ordinance, and so the report reviews these ordinances in detail. And the purpose of it was to set the stage for developing a national model for how this might work in the planning and zoning environment, to develop the legal tools necessary and the analytical tools necessary to help communities design an offset program for their use. So we came up with a program that we decided to call NetBlue, and many of you would say, well, isn't that really net zero? Isn't that what you're talking about here? In many respects, there are lots of similarities to a net zero type program, but many net zero developments are off-grid, and we didn't ever want to imply that this program would be an off-grid development program. We mean for people to connect to water and sewer services where those services are available. What this program is attempting to do is help modulate the impact of that new development on water supply infrastructure. So we did secure some funders to help us launch a 3-year project to create this national model ordinance toolkit, and we wanted to do it in such a way that we could accommodate all the variations across the country, allow it to be tailored and customized to meet local communities' needs. And we had 3 great partners working together on the project. In addition to the Alliance for Water Efficiency, we had the Environmental Law Institute and also River Network working with us as partners in this project throughout the 3-year period. We're in the 3rd year of the project now. We launched our toolkit just last month, and we're now starting to work with communities in an outreach basis to refine the use of those tools. We're grateful to our funders. The Sherman Foundation was the principal funder out of New York, but the Paul Johansson Foundation and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California all provided funding. And also in providing support were 7 partner cities that worked with us over this period of time to review our drafts, to review the material that's been assembled, and to now take a look at the finished toolkits and see whether those materials are usable in their communities. So the 7 communities are shown here on the map. They're Bozeman, Montana, the San Francisco region in California, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Austin, Texas, Madison, Wisconsin, Acton, Massachusetts, and Cobb County, Georgia. So you can see it's a variety of communities of different resource constraints in different parts of the country. We were looking for geographical distribution of those communities. We also assembled a great group of experts who helped us on a project advisory committee. We wanted experts in planning and zoning, in the developer and builders world. We wanted water lawyers. We wanted representatives from the American Planning Association. We wanted architects who worked in sustainability and green infrastructure. We wanted municipalities, so we had the League of Cities, as well as representatives from the city itself. And we also wanted the environmental perspective, so we had Brian Richter from the Nature Conservancy. So we had, leading experts in their fields as experts advising us on the development of this program. So here's the toolkit that we've assembled that we launched in May, and we'll spend the rest of this time talking about what's in it and how you can use it. And it consists of 7 basic elements. There's a model ordinance worksheet, there's a user guide to how you use that model ordinance, and then there are 3 ordinance examples. Then there's an offset methodology workbook. This is a workbook to help you calculate how an offset can minimize that water demand and make you water neutral. Then there's an offset methodology user guide and 3 more examples of the offsets that match the ordinance examples from above. And then there's a set of outreach materials. So we'll talk about all of that today. So I'd like to turn it over now to Adam Schempp of the Environmental Law Institute, who will talk about the approach being used in the model ordinance worksheet.
Thanks, Marianne. So ELS started the development of this model ordinance using the great research by Bill that Marianne just mentioned in the AWE report. We added to that other examples, concepts from literature on the subject, and consideration of various scenarios with the help of the project advisory committee that you just saw on the screen. We then tore all of this apart and started rebuilding this Frankenstein of sorts from the many different pieces. So parts of the existing ordinances that appear throughout the model ordinance worksheet. In fact, if you've had a chance to look at it, you'll see that each section has a hyperlink to the ordinances that provided some of the language or concepts in that section to give you a little bit more context and hopefully allow you very quick access to see what others have done with very similar issues. But just the existing water offset ordinances were insufficient to address all of the foreseeable scenarios for which this product hopefully might be used. And we needed some glue to hold it all together. And for this, we relied on other laws and language and structure, for the language and structure. Next slide. Thank you. I say all of the foreseeable scenarios, but the reality is that this tool can't address all factors. There are just too many local details, different legal, political, social, hydrologic, and other constraints. As Marianne mentioned, when we started this project, we knew that a traditional one-size-fits-all model ordinance wouldn't really work. So we chose to develop a worksheet that would help users build an ordinance that is right for them. We put as many options as we could without being overwhelming, we hope, and added some explanatory language in the text boxes to sort of provide a bit of an in-worksheet guide to the different decisions that have to be made when crafting an ordinance of this nature. The worksheet is really meant to be a start to the conversation, helping individuals of any background or role identify and think through the key issues for adopting this approach in his or her community. We expect everyone to tinker with the language even beyond the confines of the worksheet, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Next slide. So we structured the worksheet the same way that a standard ordinance would be. It starts with the legal foundation, the intent behind the adoption of the ordinance, the factual basis for adopting the ordinance, and the authority of the adopting entity to adopt the ordinance. Then came the meat of the ordinance, details regarding the requirement or incentives offered, if that's the approach chosen, the definitions, some of which are really critical to the breadth and effect of the ordinance, and I'll cover one of these in more detail in a minute, how the offset amount is determined, and the approved offset activities. Next is how the ordinance is enforced, the deadline for completing the offsets, how completion is verified, and remedies for failing to comply. Monitoring after the fact, so actual water usage in practice, is an optional but suggested component of the ordinance. Similarly, the next four sections need not be included in the ordinance, but might be desirable. So an offset credit bank, which is fashioned largely off of the one in Santa Fe, an in lieu fee option, a requirement that certain fees be paid to cover administrative expenses, and a process for requesting a modification like a waiver or variance. Finally, some basics. Who may appeal and through what process? The fact that the rest of the ordinance remains intact if one part is deemed illegal or unenforceable, a clarification on the effect that the ordinance has on other laws, and when the ordinance takes effect. Next slide. Just as some of the ordinance sections are optional, each section is filled with options for tailoring. So this is a screenshot of the start of the purpose section that I'm going to use to help explain some of the functionality of the worksheet. There is mandatory language, which you'll see in black. Anything that's in black that is not preceded by a text box is mandatory information. Now, like I said earlier, this can be changed after the fact, after you've used the worksheet. But for our purposes, we highly recommend this language, and I will get into the details about the two different types of worksheets in a minute, and how you might be able to make changes after the fact. So with regard to the check boxes, can you go back? With regard to those check boxes, you obviously just clicked on the content or the checkbox for the content that you would like to include. Many of these sections actually have at the bottom of the list an insert other option to include more tailoring. The blue language that you see there, the blue text, identifies fill in the blanks, with that text serving as a little bit of a prompt for what type of information to insert. And then the purple text denotes multiple choices. So if you click on that text, a little arrow will appear and it'll give you a drop-down of different options to choose from. So as I mentioned earlier, there are two versions of this worksheet. One is automated, which will create a nicely finished Word document for you. at the tail end of completing all of this sort of tailoring. And all you have to do is press the Press Me button, click on the Press Me button at the end of the document. It takes somewhere between 10 seconds and a minute to actually run all of the macros to get rid of all the things you didn't choose, the extra guiding text, etc., to finally give you a polished Word document. This actually works best in Word 2010, so if any of you try it out, I would highly recommend doing it there, again, because of the macros and the unique elements that are built into that structure of that worksheet. There is also an unautomated version. It has the exact same text, but just without the macros, without the functionality of giving you that final product. Next slide. So with my last few minutes, I want to highlight 3 of the key parts of the ordinance. First, rather than repeating the options at all necessary points regarding the actions that trigger the ordinance, we built it into the definition section and used the term application throughout the document. So this really was a result of this worksheet being very tailorable. And again, when you get that final Word document from the automated version, you can go back and make whatever changes you feel necessary, including replacing applications with the specific activities that do trigger this event. But for purposes of trying to make this simple for the worksheet, this is how we've gone about it. Now, this is a list here of some of the key, most common applications that we felt might be things to consider in terms of when the ordinance may be triggered, and hence when water offsets are required or, as the case may be, incentivized. Next slide. So a critical component to a water offset ordinance is projecting the added demand on the system from the proposed development. And the worksheet breaks this projection into 3 pieces. First, the total projected annual water demand of the property once that construction is completed. This can be done in multiple ways, and many of those variations are offered as options in the worksheet. Second, if the property had an existing annual water demand, such as in the case of remodeling, that amount will be deducted from the total projected demand. Again, there are a lot of different ways of calculating this, and many of those are reflected in the worksheet as options. And third, if some or all of the total projected water demand will be fulfilled by alternative sources, however a community chooses to define or what they choose to include as quote-unquote alternative sources. And again, the definition section of the worksheet provides a lot of different options for that. The alternative supply amount will be subtracted from the total projected demand. Next slide. The last part I would like to highlight is the percentage offset that is required, or as the case may be, necessary to receive the offered incentives. So once the total projected demand is determined and any existing demand and alternative supply amounts are subtracted, that figure is multiplied by the percentage identified in the ordinance. Now, this percentage could be high. Existing ordinances have been as high as 200%, but anything over 100%, the ordinance really should clearly indicate why. And some of those common reasons are offered in this worksheet, such as a margin of safety or community health and safety purposes, such as firefighting or fire hydrant testing. The percentage also could be low, significantly under 100%, particularly in areas where the problem, such as water scarcity or saltwater intrusion, is not in full force yet, but certainly is mounting, and a problem that is on its way. And the community is interested in starting to do something about it sooner rather than later. So if the problem gets worse, but the ordinance is having an impact, is reducing the effects, increasing that percentage at that time could be a good approach. You already have the ordinance, and it would be just a modification in what that percentage requirement is. I know that this is just scratching the surface. I'd be happy to go into any of this in further detail during the Q&A portion. Please feel free to use the chat box to enter in any of your questions. But for now, I will hand the reins back over to Mary Ann.
Thank you very much, Adam. I appreciate that. So that's the legal side of the planning and zoning ordinance. What we want to show you now is how that offset would be calculated. And we'll have two speakers, Bill Christensen and David Mitchell, talk about how the methodology workbook is structured and how you can use this workbook, whether you're a developer seeking to define what an offset might look like, or whether you're a Planning and Zoning Commission member wanting to evaluate what the offset would be for an application, or whether you're water utility working with your community to help define those offsets. The workbook can be used for all three. So right now I'd like to turn it over to Bill Christensen, who will start walking us through what's in this workbook.
All right, thank you, Marianne. So right now we're looking at the intro screen of the methodology workbook. And you'll notice a theme throughout the workbook. Right now we see a white text box that contains information about each worksheet. And this lists all the different worksheets within the workbook, and the user can use these as links to navigate the workbook, or they can use the tabs that are found in Excel workbooks. So if you'd advance to the next slide, I'll talk about the different components of the workbook. So the user starts out by entering the new demand that will be offset. So whatever the new development will have in terms of water use is entered in the sheet. And then the user can use the offset workbook to look at different strategies. It looks at kind of common or existing conservation strategies, and also contains add-ons where you can evaluate rainwater harvesting and potential stormwater capture strategies. Then the user can compile a list of offsets that they would like to pursue. I'm sorry, I just cut out. Can you hear me still?
Yes, you're there.
Oh, sorry. So then there's a selected offsets worksheet that the user can tally and select offsets and determine the number of each strategy that will be required to meet the total offset. And then there's also an inefficient toilet stock estimator included in the workbook that is very helpful in determining how many inefficient toilets might be in a given service area. And we'll take a closer look at that as we go through each worksheet. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. All right, so here we're looking at the offset strategy worksheet. And at the top of the page, you see a white text box with instructions on how to use this worksheet and what is contained in it. And one of the things it says there is that all the white cells are user inputs, and all the cells that are highlighted green on this worksheet are automatically calculated by the model. So if we go down to step 1, which is under that text box, we'll see enter information about the new or expanded water use. And the first thing we do is assign a name. And in this case, it says example development, which is a very creative name. And then we have our projected new potable water demand entered. And in this case, it's 500,000 gallons. And the user has the option to select gallons, million gallons, acre feet, liters, or megaliters per year. Next, the user answers some yes/no questions about rainwater harvesting or stormwater harvesting. And in this case, we have no selected for each of those cells, but we'll go into those topics a little later in this presentation. And then back to what Adam was talking about in terms of the percentage of the new demand that must be offset. In this example, we have 110%. So then the model calculates under step 1 the total offset. In this case would be 550 gallons per year. I'm not sure if you can see that clearly on your screen, but it's the final cell under step 1. And so if that value were 200%, for example, that value would be 1 million instead of 550. So for step 2, the user enters persons per household for the service area, And this is entered for both single-family and multifamily households. And this information is used to create an estimate for savings for toilet replacement strategies. And so under step 3, which is the final portion of the worksheet that we're looking at on the screen now, we have our offset strategy list. And the workbook comes with 13 strategies built in that are default and contain a savings estimate example. The user on the third column that's highlighted white enters their own estimate. So it comes with built-in example savings, but then the user ultimately enters their value. They can choose to use the built-in example, but they have the option to have their own if they've conducted research for their service area and have a value they would like to use. I mentioned that it comes with 13 built-in strategies, and then there's also the rainwater harvesting calculator and a stormwater calculator as well, and there's room for 8 custom measures that can be entered. And if we look to the column to the right of the user-specified estimate, which is highlighted white, the model automatically calculates how much of a certain activity would be required to meet the full offset value. So in this case, if we look at the top row, the single-family toilet replacements, we see that there's about 58 required. So they could meet the total offset with approximately 58 single-family toilet replacements. And that's just there to give some information about what it would take for each strategy. And then it asks the question, is there a related plumbing code? And in the case of toilets, there is. And this is important because if this strategy were followed, we would know that the savings would be theoretically permanent, which is the next column. It mentions the useful life of a strategy. If we employed a strategy with a very short useful life, we would have to renew that activity to continue savings in the future. So that's there just for some insight, as well as the next column, which addresses the seasonality of the water savings. If we were offsetting new development and we needed it to be even throughout the year, we would have to be careful about selecting outdoor water use programs or something like a cooling tower program that might achieve the bulk of its savings during the hot summer. And then the second to last column is the percent of the total offset achieved by one replacement or one retrofit. And so it's similar to a previous column, but expresses it as a percentage. And then the final column on the offset strategies worksheet, step 3, is whether or not we want to include it in our selected offsets table. And so here on the first row, we've selected yes. And you can see a series of other strategies that are listed and have a value in the third column of step 3, also have yes selected. And so by selecting yes, when we move to the next worksheet, so you can advance to the next slide, Marianne. If we select yes and have a savings value, we then move to the selected offset table, and we can click the button at the top of this worksheet that says Update Selected Offsets Table, and it'll automatically populate it based on our selections. So here we have a populated table, and under the button, of course, there's our white text box with directions and information about this worksheet. And then we can fill out the third column, which is highlighted white as in the previous worksheet, and enter the level of activity for each strategy. So here we've got single-family toilet replacements as our first row, and we have our savings value that was brought over from the previous worksheet, and then the number to be implemented. And then the final column shows the percent of the total offset requirement that's achieved for each strategy based on those implementation values, and then whether or not we're hitting 100% as the total. And so this can be used to tally up the level of activity and determine how much of each strategy you'd like to do to meet that offset requirement. So next slide, please. So we mentioned the inefficient toilet stock estimator, and this is just included as a bonus to help users evaluate how many inefficient toilets are in a service area. And by that, I mean toilets that have a 3.5 gallon per flush volume or greater. And the reason we did this is because if you can replace toilets, they tend to be at the top of the list in terms of reliability, of savings, and cost effectiveness. So we start here by entering our current year, whether or not the community is located in California or Texas. So in California or Texas, they required 1.6 gallon per flush toilets starting in 1992, and the rest of the country, through the Energy Policy Act, those requirements went into effect in 1994. And then the user fills out some information about single-family housing units, multifamily housing units, and then the number of full and half bathrooms in single-family and multifamily housing units. And if you don't have that information, you can click on the button to the right of those data inputs that says bathrooms per household table. And then it'll automatically bring up a table and give you that information. And then it produces at the bottom of this worksheet the estimated inefficient toilets for single-family and multifamily households. And the workbook, you can't see it, but if you scroll to the right, has some built-in data that you can use to get familiar with this worksheet. And so this is the conclusion of my presentation so far, and I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Bill. So I'm going to talk about another calculator in the workbook, which is the rainwater harvesting calculator. And what the rainwater harvesting calculator does is calculate the amount of harvested rainwater from cistern storage systems that would be available to offset demand at the development or for offsite. And it does this by simulating daily performance of a cistern system over a 10-year period using the weather data that you import to the model. And it estimates then, using that simulation, the potential on-site uses for landscape irrigation or for indoor plumbing that could be met through rainwater harvesting. And also it calculates any surplus harvested rainwater that wouldn't be used on location but could be available for use off-site. And there are 4 steps to set up and use the calculator, and I'll briefly walk you through each of those steps. Next slide. So when you go to the rainwater harvesting calculator worksheet, this is what you'll be greeted with, and there's a lot of text on this slide, and most of that text is just explanation and instruction to walk you through the calculator, but it does look a little intimidating at first, and so my task here is to convince you that it's really not that hard. Let's go to the next slide and we'll start with the first step. So the first step is to import weather data into the workbook that will be used in the simulation. And what we've done is we've linked the workbook to a website where all the data that's needed for the calculator can be gathered. And we will simply walk you through the steps at that website to be able to download a data file with all the data that you need. And then once you've done that, you'll come back to the workbook and there'll be a button under step 1 that says import weather data, and you'll then get the familiar Windows file dialog, and you can navigate to where your data was downloaded and click the open button, and it will pull all of that data into the workbook, and that will be the completion of step 1. Now I want to point out that this step only needs to be done once for an area where there's development. Once the weather data is imported into the workbook, you do not need to repeat this step each time you want to use the calculator unless you were to want to use the calculator for an entirely different region where that weather would no longer be applicable. Let's go to the next slide. So now that the calculator has the weather data to simulate both daily weather, temperature, and rainfall, we can start thinking about how much water might be needed for landscape irrigation. And so we've set this up using what's called the SLIDE method, or the Simplified Landscape Irrigation Demand Estimate approach. And what you do as a user in the calculator is fairly straightforward. The first thing you'll do in step 2 is tell the calculator what your irrigation season, how many months your irrigation season spans. So in the example here, I've indicated that the irrigation season spans between March and October, meaning that when irrigation other than rainfall occurs is typically in the months March through October. Now, if you're in a location where irrigation occurs year-round, you would simply enter January to December, and then the model would know that irrigation occurs year-round. The next thing you do is for the site where the rainwater harvesting system will be installed, you indicate the number of square feet, or if you're using metric units, the number of square meters of landscaped area that could potentially be irrigated with harvested rainwater. And then lastly, you go to the table below, which says plant type, and for each plant type category, you enter in the percent of that total landscaped area, what that will be planted to that category. So in this example, we show that 50% of the area is expected to be planted to general cool season turf grasses, and 25% is expected to be planted to trees, shrubs, vines, and ground covers, 10% to perennials, and 5% to annual flowering and bedding plants. The calculator uses that to calculate what the daily and seasonal irrigation demand for the landscape will be using the SLIDE method that I mentioned before. The user can also set the distribution uniformity for the irrigation system, which determines how much water needs to be applied to get effective irrigation. We include a standard value of 75%, and then in the user guide we discuss how that value could be modified if the user chose to do so. Once you've completed this step, you've set the calculator up to be able to simulate landscape irrigation water demand for that 10-year simulation period. Let's go to step 3. So in step 3, you have an option to simulate indoor uses of harvested rainwater. This is not required. A user could say, if that was not something that would be done with the system, then the user can select none at the top where it says select type of site. And in that case, you would do nothing further. You would just move on to the next step. But if you were intending to use the harvested rainwater for indoor plumbing purposes, then you would indicate first what type of site the system is being installed in. In this example, we selected residential, but you can also select different types of commercial sites. But I'll work through this example with residential. The next thing you need to do is indicate the average persons per household, and as Bill indicated previously, when you set up the offset workbook to begin with, you have already developed that estimate, and so you would just carry it into this part of the workbook. Then you just indicate for the calculator whether the harvested rainwater would be used for toilets or clothes washers, and you can pick one or the other or both. Once that's done, you enter in the daily plumbing fixture utilization rates, and we include recommended values for each of these fields. So for toilets flushes per person per day, we recommend 4.75, and for clothes washer use, we recommend 0.3 loads per person per day. And these recommended values are taken from the residential end use studies that have been done for North America over the past 15 years. Then you enter in your fixture water use, and again we provide recommended values. We recommend using ultra low flow toilets with 1.28 gallons per flush, and clothes washer water use per load of 31 gallons per load, which is again based on the end use study data. And from that, the calculator can estimate daily water use for these fixtures. And then lastly, if you look at this last table on the slide, above the total line, there is other potential water use. So if there is some other potential indoor water use that we have not accounted for, that's going to be different other than toilet or clothes washer, you can enter in the daily expected demand for that other potential use, just to give you a little bit more flexibility. Let's go to the last step. So now you've set up the calculator so it can simulate your outdoor landscape irrigation demands and your indoor plumbing demands that could be potentially met with harvested rainwater. So the last step is to tell the calculator what your what are the design characteristics of your harvested rainwater system or your cistern. And so again, you start in this table by telling the model what the average runoff coefficient is, and that's simply how much of the harvested rainwater can you effectively use. And the recommended value for typical systems is 0.85, and in this example we're using 0.85. The next thing you enter is the area from which rainwater will be harvested, and that's typically going to be from rooftops, but it could also be from ground level hard surfaces. And what you do is enter in the total drainage surface area that will be supplying the cistern. The next thing you do is indicate whether you're installing a cylindrical or a rectangular cistern. And we have, in this example, selected cylindrical. And we have to now tell the calculator what the dimensions of that cistern are. So in this example, we indicate that it has a 5-foot diameter and a 9-foot depth. And from that information, the calculator can determine the footprint area of the cistern, the volume of the cistern in cubic feet, and also in gallons. If we had selected rectangular, then it would ask us for the length, width, and depth of the cistern, and then it would again calculate the footprint area and the volume. On the right, you see that it says in red, cistern volume check OK, and that's just a safety check we have, or a value check we have to make sure that you are entering a cistern size or volume that would be sufficient to capture a minimum threshold of water of rainfall, and the threshold we use is 1/4 of an inch per day. And so if you enter in a cistern that is too small to be able to capture that amount of water, a warning will occur in that box to alert you. So let's go to the review the results. So once you've completed those 4 steps, you're just about done. The last thing to do when you review your results is to indicate how many sites within the development will receive a rainwater collection and storage system that you just specified. So in my example, we have 10 sites that are receiving this system. And the next thing that the results tell you is the simulated amount of landscape irrigation demand, as well as the simulated amount of indoor plumbing water use. And these add up, in this example, to about 1.2 million gallons per year. The next thing that the calculator tells you is the average annual harvested rainwater used on site. So this is telling you how much of the harvested rainwater could be utilized either for landscape irrigation or indoor plumbing. And in this example, it's about a little over 100,000 or close to 110,000 gallons. And that represents 9% of that total demand for landscape irrigation and indoor plumbing. And then lastly, it tells you whether or not there is surplus harvested rainwater. And surplus harvested rainwater is rainwater where that's been collected, but you have nowhere on site to store it. The cistern in particular days is full, and this is the amount of surplus that could be potentially redirected and stored and utilized off-site. And in this example, it's a little over 155,000 gallons. There's a number of graphics that accompany the calculator. I've shown one here behind this table that's indicating for each month the average amount of captured runoff or harvested rainwater, the amount of overflow that could potentially be redirected for use off-site, and the amount of on-site water use. In this example, I'm using weather data for a location in California, and so you can see that Mediterranean pattern in our water use where we have very little precipitation in California for the May through September period, and so there's not a lot of harvesting that occurs in those months. They occur primarily in the fall, spring, and winter months. So that's the rainwater harvest calculator, and I'll now pass back to Bill so he can talk about the stormwater calculator.
All right, thank you, David. So now we are looking at the stormwater calculator worksheet that's in the workbook, and for sake of time, I'll go through this rather quickly. But what we're looking at here is a conceptual framework of the EPA's National Stormwater Calculator. So in order to use this worksheet, the user has to go to the EPA's National Stormwater Calculator and fill it out and ultimately get a set of outputs that you bring back and enter into this worksheet. So at the top of this page, you see it says click for a link to the EPA National Stormwater Calculator. That'll take you to the web page, and you can download the free desktop application and run it on your machine. And it goes through things like your site location, the type of soil, the topography, whether it's hilly or flat, and then things like precipitation and evaporation. And it gives you information about runoff that then you can determine whether or not you could capture that and potentially use it off-site. So if we look at the bottom of this screen capture on this slide, the data that the user would ultimately enter is the area, and in this example it's 2 acres, and then the runoff value that you get from the stormwater calculator, which in this example is 6.13 inches of annual runoff, and then the proportion of that runoff that could be used off-site. And then if the user selects up on the offsets worksheet, so the offset strategy worksheet, that they want to use the stormwater calculator, then this information would be used to populate a savings estimate for a possible off-site offset. And then that value would be entered into the offset strategies worksheet and could ultimately be brought over to the selected offset worksheet where we tabulated our different offset strategies. So Marian, if you could go to the next slide. We just have a screen capture of the EPA website. So this is what it'll look like. If you click that link, you'll be taken to this page, and you can read and watch a video about the instructions on how to use it and what it's about, and download it for free. So that's all I'll touch on that for now. And I'll turn it back to you, Marian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, David and Bill, for that great discussion of the methodology calculator. I know we are running pretty late in this webinar. We have a few more things to show you, so bear with us. We'll probably run a little bit more than over the hour, but we'll go quickly through the remainder of what's here. This chart that you see here is just meant to outline in the planning and zoning process where the whole concept of offsets would be considered. And what we envision is that an applicant who does a pre-review meeting, you can see my cursor in the box in the upper left-hand corner, would determine, does my development require an offset? If yes, then they would start having pre-meetings with the Planning and Zoning Commission or even the water utility to look at what the strategies might be for an offset before they submit the application and then go through the planning and zoning process. So this is and this is also available on our website, which I'll show you. But it's just a stylized diagram of how the whole planning and zoning process would work if an overlay ordinance for offsets is adopted. We also have 3 examples that we've put together for you, and we wanted to give you some examples to show you the diversity of options of how the ordinance could work and how the methodology for the offsets could work together with those examples. Each one of those 3 examples are different, but they all come from the same source materials of the toolkit. And one of the reasons we wanted to show you some examples is we wanted to show you that in many cases an offset is not likely to be a very onerous requirement. It might be some very simple retrofits that will yield the amount of water required. But we know that the devil's in the detail there, so we wanted to show you some quick examples and also stress to you that there are user guides available for all of this. There's a user guide for the model ordinance worksheet, and there's also a user guide for the offset methodology. So you will have written materials to help work you through what you've been hearing about today. So very quickly, I wanted Adam and Bill to go through the offset examples. Adam will talk about the ordinance, and then Bill will talk about the offset.
Thanks, Marianne. So this is the most robust of the 3 examples, requiring over 100% offset of the projected net increase in annual water demand, requiring monitoring after occupancy, and applying to new buildings, remodels, as well as changes of use. In this example, the ordinance was adopted by city government. The source of water at issue is surface water, and the problem being addressed is frequent water shortages. Bill?
Yeah, next slide, please. So we created an example of a new development and then example offsets just to provide users an example of how to use the workbook. So for this, we had a development of 5 single-family dwelling units, and the projected annual water demand is 500,000 gallons. And as Adam mentioned, the required offset amount is 110%, so 550,000 gallons per year. And the offset strategy selected would be single-family toilet replacements of 3.5 gallon per flush or higher with WaterSense toilets at 1.28 gallons per flush. So the estimate for each toilet savings would be 10,000 gallons per year for this service area, and then they could achieve the offset with 55 single-family toilet replacements. So we walk you through that exercise in the document and show screen captures of the workbook.
So the second example, by the way, these are all available on the website. The second example is the most basic of the 3, offering incentives to offset the projected net increase in annual water demand rather than requiring it. To be eligible for those incentives, only 75% of the projected demand increase needed to be offset, and water use monitoring after occupancy is not expected in order to receive those incentives. In this example, the ordinance was adopted by county government to address a mounting saltwater intrusion problem to their groundwater resources, and an in lieu fee option is included in the example. Bill?
All right, so for this example, we have a new development that's a multi-unit office building with a projected annual water demand of 5.8 acre feet. If you don't think in acre feet, that's 1.9 million gallons. And the offset amount of 75% is 4.35 acre feet. The offset strategy here is various retrofits of commercial facilities as identified by the local water utility. So if you could go to the next slide, we can look at those examples. So here the water utility reached out to commercial customers and found 8 restaurants that would replace their pre-rinse spray valves, 2 that would replace dishwashers and food steamers. And then they were able to find a laundromat that would replace 6 clothes washers. They also found 1 office building that would replace 8 urinals, and then they found 30 single-family homes and 30 multifamily housing units that would replace their toilets. So they had a suite of measures, and that's all included in the example. So we can go to example 3.
All right, so the third example is not as robust as the first one, but it is more so than the second one. It requires 100% offset of the projected net increase in annual water demand, requires monitoring after occupancy, although not for as long and is with as much enforcement connection as with the first one, and it applies only to site plan approval requests. In this example, the ordinance was adopted by county government to address anticipated water shortages from surface supplies. Also of note in this example, allowable offsets include reduced water consumption on irrigated ag lands, and as I referenced earlier, that alternative sources of water supply concept includes water sustainably obtained from sources unconnected to the surface water source at issue in this case. Bill?
All right, so for the offset example here, we mixed it up a little bit. We have a new beer brewery in the service area, and their projected annual water demand is 1.75 million gallons per year. They have a rainwater harvesting system that meets nearly 100% of their toilet flushing needs. So it brought down their water demand quite a bit to 1.7 in the example. And in terms of the offset strategies, they decided they would go forward with 129 single-family toilet replacements, but their rainwater system actually produces an excess of water, nearly 350,000 gallons, and they're going to try to work with a neighboring customer of the utility to potentially use that as an offset as well. So they'll divert that water captured in their rainwater harvesting system to another customer and theoretically offset that water use. So that example walks you through the use of the rainwater harvesting calculator as well.
Thank you, Bill and Adam, very much. Now we just want to conclude by talking about the outreach materials which we've prepared on the NetBlue program. We have a fact sheet which it is very similar to the screenshot you have here. The screenshot is actually a frequently asked questions handout, but these matching sets, which are printable documents, are available to you to use for public information and developer information purposes. All of these outreach items are online, and if you would like the toolkit that we've just walked through, the ordinance worksheet, and the offset methodology workbook, all you do is go to the website, which is listed here, www.net-blue.org, and it takes you to a suite of pages where you can get information about all those various pieces and request copies of the toolkit, which we will send to you. The reason we don't have you download directly is that we want to make sure we have a record of who gets it, because as I'm about to tell you, we are actually revising already the methodology workbook, and those of you who got version 1 will now be getting version 2. So just to conclude, you know, we came up with this project because water and growth we feel are very integrally linked. We want to make sure that new development has the water it needs and that the community has an investment in both the water supply and the development in that linked regard. And we want to make sure that water supply planners and planning and zoning administrators and land use planners talk to each other. They have been in separate silos for many years. We're hoping to try to pull them together in a more active basis with this program. And we're also active with the American Planning Association, who is recognizing that this water and land use connection is important and needs to be fixed. And there is now an APA Water and Planning Network, which you are welcome to join. I don't even think you have to be an APA member to join the LinkedIn network, but a lot of these issues will be discussed going forward. So in closing, you know, I know we've exceeded our time a little bit, but I hope we have some questions, and we'll move to those in a minute. Just some housekeeping details. We'll have a PDF of the presentation and a link to this recorded webinar. We'll have that ready and posted by next week. So certainly by Monday or Tuesday it'll be available. And as I mentioned before, we are already doing changes to the offset methodology workbook. So if you receive version 1 of the toolkit, you will automatically receive version 2 sometime next week. So if we don't answer your questions today, or if you had to leave us because of the time constraints, send the questions to us, send them to Liam at this address, and we will go ahead and answer them directly to you. And then a final announcement. This is part one of a two-part webinar series. The second webinar will be held on September 6th at 11 o'clock Central, and we're calling it NetBlue Office Hours, where it'll be a more interactive opportunity to talk about how these tools have been applied in various communities, what were some of the issues that have arisen, and give you an opportunity for a lot more interchange with the experts who have put all this together. So at this point, I'd like to go to our questions. Liam, do we have questions to ask our panelists?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions, so I'll get right to them. The first one looks like it's for Adam. Why isn't monitoring optional? Isn't this critical to getting long-term support for the ordinance, including modifications where needed?
We made a lot of things optional that I think would be really nice to have in all ordinances. If you've had a chance to take a look at the monitoring section of the worksheet, you'll see that there are actually different pieces within the monitoring section that are also optional as to basically how well connected it is to enforcement, if it's more or less just trying to get information from the new development once it's been occupied as to their water usage, and therefore learn from that going down the road for purposes of implementation of the ordinance and what sort of expectations are set. Or it can be connected to if you're not meeting the expected volumes of usage, whether you're under or you're over, either being penalized and needing to offset those numbers if you're over, or if you're under, potentially getting credits for being under. But we also didn't want to make this necessarily an obstacle to otherwise getting this through. And so, yes, I would highly support including monitoring for any one of those reasons that I just mentioned, but it's something that if a community felt like that was going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, I think that this could probably live without it.
All right. The next question looks like it was in response to the offset strategy worksheet. They asked which municipality requires a demand offset of 200%.
Well, let me jump in. This is Mary Ann. Yeah, let me just say that the offset percentage is voluntary and determined by the community. 1-to-1, gallon per gallon offset is 100%. 75% would be less than that. 200% would be twice that. If a community is really water short and wants to develop additional capacity, they could consider a 200%, but we find that to be a pretty unlikely option. But Bill may have found a 200% in his reviews, so I'll turn it over also to Bill and Adam to answer that.
Yeah, this is Bill. I'll just say in the review of the literature and current ordinances out there, there are quite a few that do have what we call 2-to-1 offsets, or you have to offset twice the amount. So I don't want to list any communities off the top of my head and maybe mislabel someone, but you can look at the report that's posted on AWE's website, and it does have some communities in there.
Okay, the next question looks like it's for Bill. Why isn't on-site wastewater recycling for non-potable uses listed as an important offset?
Well, it's not currently listed, and Mary Ann, feel free to chime in as well. If you had a project, you could include that as a custom offset, but right now there's not enough in terms of savings data to use it as a built-in example. So Mary Ann, you may have a comment or something to add on that.
No, I think that's exactly what I would have said too. We've done examples where we had information that we could properly scale the response, and this could be made a customized offset. Conceptually, it's possible. We just didn't build it in as an option in the workbook.
Okay, looks like one more question for Bill. How are you estimating the saturation of inefficient toilets?
That is conducted, so I assume they're referring to the inefficient toilet estimator, and that is used, I'm trying to find it. It uses the housing stock that was built before the Energy Policy Act took effect, and then it uses a replacement rate that the user can specify. It uses 4% a year as the default, but the user could specify their own replacement rates. And so it kind of shows that natural turnover of those inefficient toilets. And then if a water utility had done a lot of toilet replacements through rebate programs, et cetera, they could subtract those values from the total that's generated in the workbook. But it's all described in detail in the workbook and in the user guide if there are any additional questions.
Okay. Regarding rainwater harvesting, since the precipitation patterns have been changing dramatically over the past 5 years, how reliable are those calculations to guarantee non-potable supply into the future?
Well, it is using historical data that is from the recent past, and so to the extent that there are significant changes in precipitation patterns, it will there'll be some misalignment, but I don't believe that we'll see climatological changes of that rapidity and magnitude for while this calculator is being used.
Okay, a couple questions about the weather data. First, is there access to Canadian weather within the weather data website?
There is. So the site that we use is the MACA website, M-A-C-A. You'll see the link to that website in the calculator, and the website contains a lot of information on how that weather data is generated. But it covers all of North America, and it's on a grid, and so you use pretty standardized mapping tools, and you can point to any location within North America and get gridded weather data for that location.
Okay, what are the parameters of the weather data, and does it take into account forecasted changes in precipitation and temperature associated with climate change? What is the reliability of this data, and from where is it gathered?
So as I said, the data comes from the MACA website, which is an acronym for, get ready, Multivariate Adaptive Constructed Analogs Data Sets. And the MACA data is pulling information from 20 global climate models that are used in the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project 5, or CMIP 5. The parameters that, the weather parameters that we are pulling, and these are historical values, are maximum daily temperature, minimum daily temperature, maximum and minimum relative humidity, daily precipitation, and daily shortwave radiation, downward shortwave radiation. And all of that information is used to calculate the evapotranspiration requirements for landscape, as well as the rainwater harvesting potential for the cistern simulation. And it is conceivable that, since we are relying on historical weather, that in the future that these patterns won't replicate exactly. Well, the intention is to provide a simulation that provides a reasonable average performance. And so we are looking at 10 years of daily data to estimate how, on average, such systems would likely perform for a particular location.
Okay, question regarding rainwater harvesting. Wouldn't eliminating irrigation and outdoor water use be the best option via xeriscaping or removal of turf, etc.?
Well, those are certainly options for any development. The idea behind the rainwater harvesting calculator is that for a development site, one way to reduce the water footprint is, to, or at least the demand for potable system water, is to meet any irrigation demand or as much irrigation demand as possible through harvested rainwater. The extent of that demand will depend on the landscape design and plant types, and there are certainly many ways in which the overall demand for irrigation water can be reduced by through that design and choice of landscape material.
Okay, another rainwater question. Why does the system not calculate the number of days per year when the rainwater cisterns are going to be dry, therefore the dual plumbing installed for non-potable uses is not being used at all?
It can. There are a number of worksheets that are background that support or do the calculations for the rainwater harvesting. So what we walked through in the presentation were the sort of the user interface that the typical user would interact with. You can actually go to the 10-year simulation worksheet, and you can see for every day what the state of cistern volume is, and you can from that calculate how many days over that simulation period the cistern would be dry.
Okay, this looks like it was in response to the examples that Adam and Bill gave. Must you demonstrate the specific offset strategy, or can you just charge your utilities cost for X amount of water savings?
So I'll start. This is Mary Ann. I'll just jump in there. Yes, you could have a developer pay a fee that would be equivalent to the utility conducting those offsets as part of their conservation program. So in other words, if the utility determined what those offsets would cost, and for them to undertake them as part of their customer outreach, a developer could pay whatever fee is specified by the utility to the Planning Commission, and then that could relieve his obligation on the offset. The utility uses the money to then do the program. That's a model that has been used in some of the examples we looked at, and it's certainly a model that could be used going forward. It does require, though, a close working relationship with the utility and the Planning Commission.
Okay, and then just one more question. Case study number 1 indicated a water demand of 500,000 with an offset of 550,000 gallons. How can the offset exceed 100% and still provide drinking water to the development?
So maybe a number of us will answer this one, but in that particular example, the offset was 110% because the utility wanted to be very, very conservative and assure that the offset was actually being provided. In a one-to-one offset, if there's any slippage in terms of the estimates of the numbers, you might not get the full 100% when it actually is implemented in the field. But at 110%, you've got a little bit of slippage, you've got a little bit more of a guarantee that you'll get that one-to-one that you're looking for. So again, the offset percentage is a community decision, and the reason in example 1 it was 550,000 gallons was it was that extra 10% that was driving that number up.
And I'll just add to that I think there are a lot of ways that the initial projection for or the demand of a new development may not fully incorporate all of the water usage, and that's what I had highlighted in the section about calculating that offset amount, what that percentage would be. There are a handful that we've listed in terms of whether it's margin of safety, which I think is what Mary Ann was getting to, or if there are elements of firefighting, hydrant testing, other water losses, maintenance uses, things of that nature that may not be fully incorporated into the on-site estimate of what the demand would be, that that amount of water should be considered within the total demand that may be needed for the system. I'll also highlight real quickly that there are really 2 ways of going about this in terms of certainty and any of that sort of safety in your calculations. One of them can be that percent of offset that's required And the other side of it can be what sort of credit or how much water offset you're giving for any of these off-site activities that may be conducted. So, I mean, obviously you've seen a number of examples provided today in terms of what amount of water, how many gallons for certain types of retrofits or other changes may occur. But if those can be modified in ways that could provide you a little bit more certainty or that margin of safety in terms of what sort of offsets you're getting in the course of ensuring that the new demand is being properly considered as it's being put online with the entire system. So both sides of the equation actually can be looked at with some scrutiny to ensure that there's some safety in those estimations.
All right, and that's all we have for questions.
Thank you, Liam, and thank you very much, Adam and Bill and David, for your presentations today in the webinar. And thank you all who have hung with us through this extra 15 minutes to be with us right through the end of the question and answer period. As I mentioned, we'll be posting the PDF and the link to this recorded webinar very shortly, probably beginning of next week. So check it out and make sure to save September 6th as the office hours NetBlue webinar and an opportunity to go into some of this in a little more detail. So thank you very much for joining us.